They say every family has secrets, but some are so dark, so deeply buried, that speaking them aloud feels like waking something that should have been left to rot. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a man who should not exist, a man who is both husband and father and son. The patriarch of a bloodline folded in on itself, a family tree without branches, only circles. He is still alive, though he looks less like a man and more like the living echo of generations that refuse to mix with the world beyond their fence line. His story is not folklore. It is not an exaggeration. It is the very real consequence of centuries of isolation, silence, and a taboo no one dared to confront until it was far too late. When you see his face, you will think it belongs to another era. The drooping features, the slurred speech, the hollow stare that suggests something half-formed beneath the surface. But what unsettles you most is not what you see, it's what you know you're looking at. Every scar, every distortion, every uneven breath is the inheritance of choices made by parents who were also siblings, by cousins who married cousins, and by a bloodline that refused to let new blood in. He is the human outcome of a cycle that should have ended long ago. People in his small Appalachian town don't like to talk about him. When his name comes up, their voices drop, their eyes wander. They speak of him not with cruelty, but with a kind of shameful reverence, as though acknowledging his existence is dangerous. Outsiders who catch a glimpse describe him like an apparition, half man, half memory of a crime no one wants to name. His house is more than a home. It is a mausoleum of genetic collapse, a reminder that family can sometimes become its own grave. But how did it begin? How does a family reach a point where a son grows up to call his own mother his wife, where a father becomes his own father, his own echo in flesh? To understand the man, the most inbred patriarch alive, we must return to the beginning. To the hills where silence held tighter than law, where poverty strangled opportunity, and where blood ties became shackles no one dared to break. This is not a story you'll find in your history books. It is whispered in fragments, hidden in archives, and tucked away in photographs too disturbing to frame. Tonight we unearth it. The roots of this family stretch deep into the hills where mountains swallowed voices and valleys kept strangers out. Generations ago, when poverty ruled the coal country and the nearest town was days away on foot, survival meant turning inward. Families clung to each other, sometimes too tightly, until the line between kinship and marriage dissolved. For outsiders, the thought is grotesque, but for those trapped in isolation, it was a necessity disguised as tradition, and once a tradition hardens, it becomes nearly impossible to pry it loose. The earliest traces of this bloodline can be found in scattered records from the 19th century. Names repeating, marriages written in family Bibles rather than county ledgers, fathers marrying nieces, cousins sharing vows. The paper trail grows foggy, not because it was lost, but because it was never meant to exist. These families knew what they were doing would not survive the scrutiny of law or religion, so they buried the truth where no preacher or sheriff would ever look, inside the walls of their own home. And that secrecy is what allowed it to fester. By the time the 20th century arrived, the outside world was modernizing. Roads were built, radios brought in voices from far away, but some valleys remained cut off. Some homes clung to their silence. Within those homes, children were born who bore the marks of too much sameness. Wide-set eyes, narrow jaws, unusual growths. They became living proof of what happens when blood has nowhere to go but back into itself. It is here that the figure at the center of our story began to take shape. Not yet a man, not yet the patriarch, but already the product of generations folding tighter and tighter. He was born not into shame, but into acceptance. To his parents, who were themselves bound by a relationship that defied any sense of morality, his arrival was not a curse. It was imply life continuing as it always had. He was their son, their child of necessity, and in time, their husband. For most, family is a source of comfort, a place of safety. For him, it was a labyrinth with no exit, where every door led back to the same room. The moment he opened his eyes, he inherited a role that would blur every boundary. Son, husband, father, all collapsed into one body. And no matter how disfigured the outcome, the family treated it as destiny. The question isn't just how this could happen, the question is why no one stopped it. To understand why no one stopped it, you have to understand the kind of silence that grows in families like these. It is not ordinary silence, it is heavy, suffocating and passed down like an heirloom. Each generation learns early that certain truths are never spoken aloud, that shame is endured in quiet rather than confessed to outsiders. In the mountains, gossip could destroy you faster than hunger, and so the family learned to build walls higher than fences. Neighbors might whisper, but few dared to interfere. What right does one starving family have to condemn another? Poverty creates complicity, and so when children were born with unusual features, it was brushed aside with muttered excuses, bad luck, poor health, a curse, anything but the truth. And as long as no one named it, the cycle continued. For the boy who would grow into the patriarch, childhood was a blur of strange normalcy. He played with cousins who were also his half-siblings. He obeyed a father who was also his uncle. He lived in a house where words like mother and wife described the same woman, and to him it felt as natural as breathing, because he knew nothing else. The world beyond those hills might have called it monstrous, but to him it was home. His body carried the proof of his heritage. Even as a child, his features unsettled those who saw him. His eyes crossed, his jaw jutted, his speech came out thick, as though language itself resisted being passed down this far into the family. Teachers, when they met him, knew something was wrong, but poverty gave them an excuse to look away. What could they do? Report him? To whom? The county had no appetite for exposing a scandal it could not fix, and so the boy grew older, hidden in plain sight, his deformities chalked up to misfortune rather than the unbroken chain of incest that created him. By the time he reached adolescence, his role had already been decided. He was not just a son, he was an heir to the family's grim tradition. Whispers inside the home turned into expectations. He would not seek a wife outside. He would not escape to another town. His destiny was to remain, to continue the bloodline exactly as it had been handed to him. The same silence that had protected the family for generations now wrapped itself around his future like a noose. And when the time came, he did not resist. The transition from son to husband was not a sudden act, but a slow tightening of the family's grip around him. There was no ceremony, no announcement. It was simply decided, silently, that he would remain where he was, that his role in the house would change, and that no outsider would ever share his bed. To those around him, it was not monstrous. It was duty. To him, it was inevitability. The lines between love, obedience, and survival had long since dissolved. The woman who bore him became the woman he called wife. Her face was weathered, her body marked by years of bearing children who often did not survive, but she accepted her son as a partner because there was no other choice. What had been motherly authority became marital submission, and in that transformation, the family erased the last remaining line between right and wrong. He was both her child and her husband, and soon her children would also be her grandchildren. The children that followed bore even heavier marks of the bloodline. Misshapen features, frail bones, twisted bodies that seemed to cry out against the generations of entrapment. Neighbors, when they caught sight of them, described the children as not quite right. Some avoided the family altogether, terrified of the sight. Others pitied them, but never enough to intervene. This silence was now shared by the whole community, a pact of avoidance, a collective refusal to see what was in front of them. And he himself, the patriarch, was aging into a grotesque symbol of the family's choices. His speech was thick, often unintelligible. His eyes darted in different directions. His movements were clumsy, uncoordinated, as though his body resisted the very act of existing. Yet he remained proud, even defiant. To him there was no shame, because shame required comparison, and he had no world beyond his own. The most disturbing part is not that he existed, but that he still exists, that he walks and breathes and carries the title of Patriarch. His story is not distant history, it is happening in real time, in the quiet corners of America where poverty and silence still hold dominion. He is not folklore, not rumor, he is living proof of what happens when blood becomes a prison. And yet, despite the horror, the family never saw themselves as villains. To them, they were survivors. Bound not by love or morality, but by desperation, secrecy, and a tradition that devoured its own children. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because what we're uncovering now is not just one family's shame, it is a mirror held up to a part of America that prefers to stay in shadow. Families like his are not accidents, they are born from conditions that crush hope, poverty, isolation, and the unspoken rule that you do not speak of what happens inside your own home. Think about what that silence means for a child. Imagine growing up in a house where words like uncle and brother describe the same man, where every face you know carries the same twisted features as your own, where you never see yourself in anyone outside your walls, and so you grow up believing your world is the only one that exists. That was his life. And when the world outside occasionally brushed against his own, it recoiled. Outsiders came, saw, whispered, and left. No one stayed long enough to intervene. The result was a cycle that deepened with each generation. The children of the patriarch were marked more visibly than those before them. Some could not walk, some could not speak, some died before they reached adulthood. And yet each birth was treated not as a warning, but as a continuation of what had always been. The family accepted suffering as destiny. To them, deformity was not tragedy, it was simply their inheritance. And the patriarch himself seemed to embody this acceptance. He did not fight it. He did not question why his life had been reduced to this grotesque cycle. In his mind, there was no alternative. He was born into silence, molded by silence, and now he carried it forward. His existence was less a choice than a consequence, and perhaps that is what makes his story so haunting. He is not a monster created by malice. He is a man created by neglect. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have run, even if it meant starving in the woods? Would you have broken the silence, even if it meant betraying your own parents? Or would you, like him, have accepted your role and carried the cycle forward? Tell me in the comments, because there is no easy answer. The story of the most inbred patriarch alive is not just about him. It is about what happens when a society decides that some people, some families, are better left forgotten. The photographs that survive of this family are like windows into a nightmare no one meant to capture. Faded, black and white images taken by outsiders brave or foolish enough to visit, reveal faces that stop you cold. Children with crossed eyes staring into the camera, jaws jutting unnaturally forward, expressions half empty yet full of something deeply unsettling. Behind them, adults stand in silence, their own features twisted echoes of the same genetic loop. Looking at these pictures feels like trespassing into a grave that is still breathing. And yet, these images are not staged. They are reality. The patriarch himself sits among them, a figure who looks both older and younger than his years, his body bent by a lifetime of inherited collapse. His mouth hangs open, drooling words no one beyond the family can understand. His eyes move in different directions, unable to hold focus, and still, in that broken body, he carries pride, a strange, defiant dignity, as though daring the world to look away. But the photographs do more than shock. They testify to something far more disturbing, that this family was never truly invisible. People knew. Outsiders came, saw, documented, and then left. They exposed the family with their cameras, but not with their actions. The images became curiosities, whispered about in hushed conversations, but the silence in the hills remained unbroken. The family continued on, while the world beyond looked at their suffering like a spectacle. This is where the horror deepens, not just in the family's choices, but in society's refusal to act. Poverty-stricken Appalachia was easy to ignore. The people who lived there were treated as relics of another time, their suffering folded into stereotypes. And so the patriarch and his kin were left to spiral further inward, each generation collapsing into the next, while the rest of America turned its bay. To see him now is to see the end of a long experiment that no one meant to begin. He is not a myth, not an exaggeration, but the final stage of a bloodline collapsing under its own weight. The photographs that exist of him are not simply images of a man, they are warnings. They show us what happens when silence replaces justice, when neglect masquerades as mercy. And yet, even now the family remains. Today the man who is both husband and son, father and grandson, remains alive. His existence is not confined to dusty archives or fading photographs. He walks the earth, though his body staggers under the weight of generations that refuse to change. To see him is to confront something that feels older than civilization itself, as though you are looking not at one man, but at the failure of an entire society to intervene. He lives in near total obscurity, surrounded by those who share fragments of his blood, those who carry echoes of the same deformities. Outsiders who stumble upon him describe the encounter in tones reserved for ghost stories. His eyes unable to focus, his mouth slack, words spilling out as broken fragments that few can understand. Yet behind those fractured expressions, he is still a man who breathes, eats, and endures. He has survived what should have ended long ago, a living monument to silence and neglect. And that is what makes him so haunting. He is not a story of the past. He is the past surviving into the present. He is a living reminder that America is filled with forgotten valleys where poverty still chains people to cycles they cannot break. His family may be extreme, but their silence is not unique. There are other families, other bloodlines, carrying secrets behind closed doors, praying the world never looks too closely. What do we do with a story like his? Do we treat him as a spectacle, a grotesque curiosity to gawk at from the safety of distance? Or do we face the uncomfortable truth that his existence is not his fault but ours? He was born into a prison built by generations before him, guarded by neighbors who chose not to intervene, and ignored by a country that saw poverty as a personal failing rather than a collective wound. The patriarch will die one day, and with him perhaps the last living branch of his family's twisted tree. But death will not erase what he represents. He is proof that silence can destroy more thoroughly than violence, that neglect can deform a life more brutally than any weapon, that some of America's darkest stories are not written in wars or politics, but in the hidden rooms of families left to devour themselves. Remember his face. Remember his story, because the most frightening thing about him is not that he exists, it's that he was allowed to